There's usually a bit of a delay. We'll go with that. Start presenting. By the way, while I'm getting set up, do feel free to stand up. Prolonged sitting isn't very good for you. It's also not very good for your brain. And I'd quite like you in a good mood, because if you thought the last talk was really depressing and miserable, it's about to get worse. I'm going to tell you how you're going to die. Okay. All right, be seated. Or stay standing, actually, if you've got a bad back. Okay, so maybe I should give you a little bit of context in terms of why I'm talking about stress and healthy aging today. I should say, yes, I am surprisingly a professor. Thanks for that one. People have asked, am I not a bit young for that? And can I just say, well, would it help if I were a man? Because I do feel there's a bit of a moustache growing here. So any day now. But a bit more of a broader context. So I work in this school, as you can see, of sport, exercise and rehab, and don't know anything about sport, to be fair. Not a lot about exercise and nothing about rehab, sorry, Jill. Because I'm originally a health psychologist, but I do a lot of multidisciplinary work. So I'm also a psychoneuroimmunologist, so I'm interested in how the brain talks to the immune system, and I'm a cardiovascular psychophysiologist, so I'm interested in what the heart does when it's exposed to things like stress, and there's a whole bunch of other ologists as well. So for today, to keep it simple, I'm a behavioral scientist. Let's see if my thing actually works. Yes. So again, it's going to be a whistle-stop tour in 25 minutes, hopefully. What do we mean by stress? How does this actually impact on your physical health? How does it get inside the body? What are the mechanisms? Obviously, I won't be able to go into massive detail, but we'll have a quick look. I'll present a little bit of the research evidence to back up what I'm saying so that you actually believe me. And then very briefly at the end, just come up with one suggestion that I think might help reduce these effects of stress. And all of this is going to be in the context of aging as well, because aging is one of my main overarching areas of research. So what is stress? Well, usually we talk about stressful life events. These are your classic top 5, unemployment, job strain, moving house, bereavement, caregiving, marriage, divorce, separation. And as I look at this list, I realise that I've done most of these, apart from moving house in the last year or so. I'm actually saving moving house till next year, because it can get a bit much. But these are the sort of things that have long-term stressful effects on you. And interestingly, some of them also relate to another very important psychological factor, which is loneliness or social isolation. So if you've been bereaved, or you're divorced or separated, or if you're a long-term caregiver, you can find yourself in a position of not having very much social support in terms of helping you deal with that stress. Often these types of stresses are quite isolating. And this is another really key psychological variable that is so important that actually, if you're among the most socially isolated, you die sooner. So I said it was going to be a happy talk. We're going to talk a lot about death. There are loads and loads of definitions of stress, and I don't really want to go into those, but one of the most useful ones for me, I find, is considering the duration of stress. So when you're first talking to people, perhaps in medicine who don't work in this area, you can have this understanding that stress is always bad. All stress is bad. You know, this is common sense. We don't need psychologists. Stress is bad, end of story. But that's not actually the case. So this is an interesting and helpful definition by looking at the difference in the duration of stress. So we have acute stress, things like standing up here giving a talk, or if you're a student doing an exam, things like I do to people in my lab in Sportex, acute stress, where I make them do maths under pressure while staring at themselves in a video screen, while being recorded, while being marked and being stared at by me, while having beeping noises at them, while the maths gets faster and more difficult as time goes on. An acute stress task, we only do it to people for 10 minutes, but it's very fun. And also hassles, things like this morning, trying to find somewhere to park, losing your keys, getting back to your hotel room and not being able to get in, that kind of thing. But these actually have quite a positive effect on the body because they're very short term. And as long as you recover again, go back to homeostasis or that state of balance that you were in, then you're okay. Chronic stress is the one that we're worried about. Chronic stress is your classic stress is bad scenario. These sorts of events we were just talking about. Because they're severe and enduring, they're not minutes or hours or even days, they're like months and in some cases years. So that's something to bear in mind while we talk about the research. So what are the mechanisms behind all of this? And how do I know that this is actually true about acute stress being positive generally for the body? Well, two of the main stress response systems are these shown here, and this is as complicated as my diagrams are going to get. The sympatho-adrenal-medullary axis, fortunately we call it the SAM axis. This is your fast stress response. This is the one that gets your heart rate going, your blood pressure up. It's the one that's adrenaline pumping out. And that's your quick response. And then hopefully, if the stressor is only short, then that will go back down. Your heart rate and your blood pressure eventually will return to where they were before. Our slightly slower stress response system is this other one, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And this is the one that releases the stress hormone cortisol. And Janet Lord may have mentioned that the other morning because we do quite a bit of work on this. And cortisol is more like a bit of a slow burn. So it's your slower, more enduring response to stress. It has lots of important effects, such as dampening down inflammation. But you really don't want it banging around your system for too long. You want it also to return to normal when the stressor is over. Now, the reason that I think stress is important for physical health is because these hormones and these communications down through your central nervous system actually talk to organs and systems in the body. So we have immune system organs that have receptors for these types of neurotransmitters and hormones. So therefore, and also obviously the central nervous system innervates a lot of these organs. So if stress, as it's perceived by the brain, starts the kickoff of these stress responses, and that eventually talks to these different organs and systems, then you could understand how stress might actually have an impact in the end on physical health. Now, because we haven't got all day, I'm going to focus very briefly on the immune system today and look at immune system effects because the immune system is important in terms of looking out for cancer, for getting rid of infection, and for controlling inflammation. So that covers quite a lot of our key diseases. Okay, and just to remind you, so the short-term activation of these systems, you do want to have a stress response. When someone's in my lab and psychologically they're as stressed out as anything, and then their heart rate and blood pressure barely move at all, those are the people I'm worried about. You need an activation. You need blood flow to increase. You need to get key immune cells to places where they need to do their work, like helping you with wound healing or fighting infection. But it's this repeated activation that eventually leads to the body kind of resetting. So if you've got prolonged, enduring stress or acute stresses over and over and over again, such as might happen if you're caregiving for a spouse with Alzheimer's, then eventually your system's going to reset. And it's not going to go back into that state of homeostasis. And that leads to wear and tear, and there are lots of different theories about that, which I won't go into now. So I mentioned cortisol, the stress hormone, and I don't know whether, did Janet talk about the other important hormone, dehydroepiandrosterone? No? Fantastic, okay. So cortisol is our stress hormone, which can actually lead to immune system downregulation, which is why you don't want too much of this banging around your system. And there's also another hormone that's very important, also comes out of the adrenals, called dehydroepiandrosterone, or DHEA. I think of this as the anti-cortisol, a bit like the Antichrist, the anti-cortisol. So cortisol is the bad guy, and in this case, DHEA is actually the good guy. So what you get with DHEA is immune enhancement. However, as you can see from this very depressing graph, that as we get older, cortisol tends to stay the same. There's some evidence of it dropping a little in some studies. But DHEA, I'm afraid, declines very much to the point where you're about 20% when you're in later life of what you had in your 20s. Yeah, it actually drops pretty rapidly from the age of 30. So most of us in this room are screwed in terms of DHEAS. But it's not all bad news. There are things you can do to boost your DHEAS. The S is the sulfate. It's just the sulfated version that we measure of DHEA. So let's get on to some of the research and see if this is actually true. Can stress really have an impact on your immune system and on your health. Of course, we're academics, so what do? We grab the nearest people and study them. So we grab undergraduate students because they're a fairly homogenous group. Don't say that to them. I'm sure none of us felt homogenous when we were undergraduates. But they are. So you get your sample and you look at the sort of stressful life events that happen to students. So they will have things like bereavement and moving house, but they'll also have things like failing a test, failing an exam, or one key aspect of the life events scale for students is going home to see your parents at Christmas. Something very stressful for your average undergraduate student. And we've looked at this sort of stress using a psychometric questionnaire, generally looking at life events, but sometimes also people's perceptions of how stressful what happened to them was, and related this to a whole range of immune outcomes. And I'm going to focus first on the vaccination response. And the reason for this is it's actually really fun, because when you give someone a vaccination, it's a bit like you're giving them a disease. They can't get that disease from your vaccine. They might feel a bit ill because they're getting immune system activation, but they can't actually get the flu or whatever it is you've jabbed them with because it is dead or attenuated. And another reason that looking at the vaccination response is useful for us is, if you're doing this sort of psychoneuroimmunology work, is because it gives you a nice readout of how effective someone's immune system is in the context of the whole of the rest of the body. So rather than taking a cell out in isolation and look at one little function in the lab when you poke it with something, this is looking at an integrated response that leads to production of antibodies, but that's right at the end of a lot of processes in the context of all these stress hormones and all the rest of the immune system and the rest of the body. So it's quite a nice in vivo measure of immune function. So here's just an example from one of my first studies in this area, actually, where we were looking at student stress, so numbers of life events on the scale on the y-axis there, including going home for Christmas. And then what we did was we gave them the flu jab. We took a blood sample at baseline just before we gave them the jab, and then we followed them up around 5 weeks later and 5 months later to look at the peak response, where you'd expect to see the most antibodies, and then also to see if that dropped off over time. So you always have to look at the baseline response. You can actually see change as an effect of the vaccination itself, not just as an effect of being exposed to flu in the environment. And for the sake of these graphs, we've split the groups into responders and non-responders. So if you are a responder to the flu vaccine, basically it means that whatever your baseline level number of antibodies was, you've increased it at least 4 times the amount. So you've got a 4-fold increase at least, which is what you want, and it's what you'd expect to see in young, healthy students. And what we have here is that people who have more of these stressful life events are actually more likely to be non-responders. So even though they're young and supposedly healthy, taking into account the fact that they probably all went out for sports night and got really drunk just before they came in to do this study, they're still showing this impact of stress on the immune system. And it's consistent because we see this later on at 5 months as well. You're still seeing a difference between those people who tend to have a lot of stressful things happening to them compared to those with fewer events. And the other important psychological factor that I've mentioned, social support, was also related to their flu response. And in this case, it's the intuitive way around that you would expect. So people who reported having more social support, so more people in their social network, and actually those friends were quite good. It's no point having a big social network if your friends are crap. You actually need to have decent friends who are supportive and can help you. And the ones who reported that were more likely to have a good immune response to the vaccines. Okay, but what about aging? Is it worse if you look at this sort of stress and then add aging on top? Because in a way, in terms of the changes that happen, particularly in the immune system with aging, aging does look a bit like stress. Some of the things that we see with stress are also happening as part of the aging process. So what happens if you put these two together? Is it like a double whammy? We were able to test this. So for the last decade, I've been really privileged, actually, to be involved in a study in the west of Scotland, in Glasgow, called the 2007 study, because it was meant to end in 2007. Actually went on until 2009, but never mind. And what they did in this study was follow people across the life course over time from 1987 until 2009. And they also looked at different life stages. So we've got 3 age groups who are about 20 years apart. And they measured a whole range of social factors, environmental factors, things that might influence someone's health over time. And in 1995, somebody had the bright idea of actually taking saliva from these individuals and using this rather odd contraption which has a dental swab in it. If you chew that for a few minutes and then stick it back in the tube here, the salivate tube, spin it down in the centrifuge, get rid of all the people's bits of breakfast and stuff, and get the saliva out the bottom, you can actually measure this thing called salivary or secretory immunoglobulin A. And all that is an antibody. It's another kind of antibody, but it's one in your saliva. Why do we care about that? Well, basically, if you think about your body and your immune system, your skin is your first line of defense. After that, it's your mucosal surfaces, or what a colleague said to me once, your wet bits. And what you want at those mucosal surfaces is a lot of this antibody, this SIgA. So the more SIgA you have, the more protected you are against things like flu and colds. So we looked at this in this sample, this large sample in Scotland, and we were particularly interested in one type of chronic stress. So we looked again at caregiving. The question was very simple. It was, is there someone that you regularly provide care for besides normally developing children? So this wasn't asking about normal child raising. This was, are you helping a neighbour? Have you got a spouse with a chronic condition? Or so on. And what did we find? Well, because there were the 3 age groups, we were able to look at the impact of this stress and aging at the same time. And what we found is that, yes, if you were a caregiver with the stress of caregiving, you had lower levels of this important salivary antibody. However, only if you were in this older group here. So we've got a bit of an interaction going on there between stress and aging, such that it's worse if you're in the older group, at least in terms of this one salivary marker of immune system health, which is quite good at giving a general readout for how functional your immune system is. Obviously, it's not all-encompassing, but it's a fairly good general marker. So people have taken this caregiving model as a model of chronic stress and really run with it, and particularly in the States, looking at individuals who are older adults with a spouse with Alzheimer's, and they've shown a whole range of effects, as you can see here, on the immune system, including poorer immune cell cytotoxicity, which is the ability of your immune cells to really kill things that they should be killing, such as infectious agents. But we asked the question, well, so much of this research has been done with older people, when it's gone into detail looking at caregivers of a spouse with Alzheimer's. Is it still an issue if you're a younger person going through this sort of chronic stress? And there was some indication in the literature that perhaps not, perhaps you're protected by the use of your immune system, even if you're a caregiver as a younger person. Because studies looking at the vaccine response in younger adults who were caring for a spouse with multiple sclerosis didn't see effects on vaccination. However, caring for someone with multiple sclerosis is very different from caring for someone with Alzheimer's who might not recognize you one day or might have bouts of uncontrollable anger and other challenging behaviors. Not that caring for someone with MS is not hard, but it's just different. It differs in terms of the sort of issues that you come up against. So what we needed really was a model that was similar to caring for a spouse with Alzheimer's, but in a younger group. So my first ever PhD student, my first baby, he came up with this great idea of looking at people who are parental caregivers for kids with intellectual disabilities. And what he found is that actually the responses to vaccination in this group were worse in these people who were caregivers. So he managed to, he was a very charming Irishman, and he managed to recruit a whole host of parental caregivers, even though they were stressed beyond belief. They came in and were vaccinated. We gave them flu in one arm, pneumonia in the other, which was nothing compared to what they normally go through during the day. And we had a matched control group. So people who were also parents but were not, their children were normally developing. And what we found was this, and I'm just going to show you a snapshot of the flu results. And what you can see, hopefully, here is that our caregivers, so our group with stress, here we are at baseline, nicely matched. At 1 month, where you'd start to see the most antibodies, that's how it works. You'd expect to see the highest levels there. Our caregivers are just not having quite as big a response as our control group. And you'd expect to see a bit of a drop-off in the levels of antibodies by 6 months. If you look at our caregivers again, they're almost back to baseline. Now, these are not older people, like some of the other research. These are young people. Well, in my opinion, these are young people, so late 30s, early 40s, absolutely in your prime. And you're still seeing this sort of effect. And also, within this study, we did see a slight interaction with aging as well. So as it says there, the ones at the higher end of the range, more towards mid to late 40s, were the ones with the poorest antibody response. But still, would you really expect to see this kind of impact in a group who are fairly young and fairly healthy? So that's caregiving stress, and there's been a lot of work on that. What about normal everyday stress, like those stressful life events that we started out with, and particularly in older people? And when we were asking this question, nobody had done this. They'd really focused in on caregiving stress and used caregiving as a model of severe chronic stress. And we were interested in thinking, well, what about just these life events? Surely older people have loads more life events than our students. Let's go and look in the general population. So we took advantage of the fact that in the UK, the NHS, the health service, tries to vaccinate everyone who's 65 plus with the flu jab annually to try and bring down those levels of flu infection. So as you can see here, we were able to recruit quite a handful of older adults. They were all 65 plus. Actually, that's not true. There were 2 blokes who were 64 who snuck into the study. They really wanted to take part in the science. And I've checked the data, and it doesn't make a difference whether they're in the study or not in terms of the results. But yeah, technically, they were 64. We had a nice split across the gender, as you can see. Some of the men were already dead, which is perhaps why there were more women. And also, some of the men that were involved in the study were kind of hassled into it by their wives. But so we did end up with more women, which is fairly normal of this kind of age group. We also tried to have quite a nice split socioeconomic status-wise by recruiting from different GP surgeries from different sorts of areas across Birmingham. Now, these are older people, so they have a range of medications and diseases. We didn't want to include anyone who'd have something that would be massively detrimental to their immune function and therefore completely mask anything that we were trying to measure. So we did exclude people with current really severe immune disease, such as cancer. However, if you exclude anyone with any disease over the age of 65, basically you end up with a sample of about 0. So we kept in the people with arthritis and all the other things, hypertension. We just made sure we recorded this and controlled for it later on. Here's just a snapshot of some of the measures. So we're doing life event stress again, but obviously not a student questionnaire this time, one that was more suitable for older adults. Took out the question about are you or might you be pregnant? Thought that perhaps wasn't quite appropriate for this age group. And we looked at social support as well, trying to replicate what we'd done in the young people. Now, the interesting thing here was that 2/3 of our sample were married, so we could really look in detail at that key aspect of social support. So in the student group, there's only one guy who was married, 66% in this sample. And then because psychologists are implicitly nosy, we also decided, well, it's not just marriage, it's the quality of your marriage that has an impact on your perceived stress levels and potentially on your health. So we asked them, how good is that marriage that you're in? With a standardized questionnaire. You know, do you make the financial decisions, or does your husband make them, or do you make them together? And then the classic one at the end, where they all start, putting their hand over their work. If you had your time again, would you marry this person? Great. We took into account also the number of previous vaccines they'd have, because that has an impact on your baseline levels before you've had the annual jab, particularly people who've been coming back to their GP for years to have their vaccine. And as I've said, chronic illness. Very similar design to the student study, antibody levels, at baseline and then looking at the increase by 1 month, what did we find? Well, surprisingly to me, for life event stress, nothing. In fact, the older adults were not reporting very many stressful events at all, which was bizarre because for some reason I got it into my head that they'd have a lot more going on than our student group. However, they did have one particular stressful life event that was very common. Anyone got any idea what it might be? No? Death, yep, there you go. Bereavement. And these were people who might have had the bereavement up to a year before because of the questionnaire we were using, but people who'd had a bereavement had a lower response to the flu jab, to actually 2 aspects of the flu jab because there's 3 strains of flu in there. And yes, they had this poorer response compared to people their same age but who hadn't had a bereavement in that time period. There was also no effect for social support. And that kind of made a bit more sense to me because I think as you do get older, perhaps your social network changes a bit. Perhaps your spouse becomes more of an important source of social support if you are married. So perhaps we'd see something more for marriage rather than social support. And that was the case. And I have to say, this is another one of the depressing bits, really, because the take-home message is that if you're going to be unhappily married, you might as well not be married at all in terms of your immune system. Because in this study, it was only the ones who were happily married that were significantly different from the other 2 groups, unmarried or unhappily married, in terms of antibody levels at least. So make the most of your marriage if you are married. This went really crazy in the press. The newspaper we have here called The Sun, one of our best quality rags, they loved it. The headline was, "Get hitched to fight flu." So there you go. For anyone who's not married, that might be something to consider. So, okay, I've talked a lot about vaccination, and I'm aware that time is shooting on. So I just want to quickly talk about other immune outcomes. And Janet might have mentioned this cell. It's her favourite, the neutrophil, which eats bacteria like pneumonia, which is a key killer of older people. And we wanted to know, well, does stress have any effect on this cell, particularly as it's a very short-lived cell, but it's very important if you're an older person, particularly in hospital after something like a hip fracture. So we followed up our interest in bereavement, and I think this was probably the first time I worked with Janet. Back in 2006, we started trying to get funding and ethical approval to follow bereaved people and get a blood sample to look at neutrophil function. It took a very long time, as you can imagine, particularly because we wanted to get people within 2 months of their bereavement. Because with neutrophils being a short-lived cell, we thought there was going to be a critical period quite close to the time of the bereavement. We did eventually manage to get a bereaved group, older adults, and a matched control group who were just non-bereaved. We were looking at neutrophil function, how well do these cells eat, how well do they produce chemicals to kill bacteria, and our favourite hormones, cortisol and DHEA as well. And this is what we found, that if you'd had bereavement in the past 2 months, actually your neutrophils, although they were fine in terms of eating, they were still engulfing bacteria, but they just weren't producing enough killing chemicals, superoxides, to actually really eradicate that bacteria. So they're not functioning quite as well. And these bereaved individuals also had a higher cortisol to DHEA ratio, which might be one of the mechanisms involved. We then followed this up and tried to test that stress and aging interaction again, and found that if you were a young bereaved person, while psychologically you had just as high levels of depression, anxiety, stress, grief, actually your neutrophils were okay. So what can we do about it? I promised I'd end with one suggestion of what can we actually do about all this stress now that everyone's probably feeling a bit miserable about bereavement and moving house and caregiving and so on. Well, I have to say this because of where I work, but also this is the direction that my research is moving in, and I would suggest that one solution might be exercise. Particularly for older adults, is this something that we can try and encourage to lessen the effects of stress? And here's just a list from a vast literature of what exercise can actually do in terms of positive effects on your body physically and mentally. The ones in red there, as you can see, are the ones that are appropriate to what we've been discussing in this session so far. It can improve your immunity, and it can also help reduce those stress levels, anxiety, depression, and low mood. Here's just a snapshot of a study, another one of my babies, who did this as part of her PhD, looking at older adults and their cortisol to DHEA ratio as an index of physiologically how stressed they were and how healthy they would be, and looking at their habitual levels of physical activity and their life event stress. It was only a small study, but we thought it had quite an interesting result because we split people into whether they were habitually doing a bit of exercise or really not, really sedentary people, not really exercising much at all, apart from perhaps to get up to put the kettle on in between their favourite programme. And what we found, it wasn't just an effect of exercise per se. It had an interaction with these individuals' stress levels. So if you were someone who wasn't experiencing much stress in their life, it didn't really make much difference to your cortisol to DHEA ratio if you were exercising or not. If you were someone with high stress, then you really want to be in this group who are exercising, because exercise interacted with stress and seemed to buffer the effects of that stress and lower these people's cortisol to DHEA ratios, which is what you want. You want a lower ratio because of the impact of these hormones on immune health. So how do we do this? And how do we particularly do this with older adults? I don't think it's all about forcing everyone to go to the gym. I went to the gym the other week. It was the first time in 20 years. It was terrifying. They had to actually explain the machines. They just look that scary. But you can actually get machines that are suitable for older people. So I've got a collaborator coming across from Finland next week, and they have these fantastic machines that work with a smart card that just are really kind of set up for you, hardly have to do anything apart from swipe in. They're also pneumatic, so you can start with zero resistance and then kind of pump up the volume as you get more healthy. So they're great, particularly for frail older adults who might have a bit of a gym phobia. And then there's also things like just making exercise or physical activity, rather, part of people's everyday routine. And can we do this in groups? Because another problem, particularly in the older age range, is that people get socially isolated. So if we can bring in social support and encourage that at the same time as building up physical activity, then that is a positive thing as well. And we're also interested in some of the frailer groups who might not find it very easy to get out of a chair, but might be able to do chair-based exercise. And this is a really fun company called Move It to Lose It, who are also working with us in the near future with the Panini boys up there who've been here all week. And this is all about having fun with music going on in a group while doing chair-based activity at the same time. Okay, it's not vigorous resistance work, but it's better than nothing. So we're going to look at the immune effects of that. And this is all part of this Horizon 2020 network I've got, which is called Panini, Physical Activity and Nutrition Influences in Aging. It's not about sandwiches. So that's kind of where this research is headed. So at this point, I'll stop, except to acknowledge all the people who are involved in the work I've talked about today, and thanks for listening.
Very much. Questions? I'll bring this mic around.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I wanted to know, is there any research on being able to, so looking at chronic stress, and if that stress finally goes away, like if the partner dies or whatnot, can the effects of this stress be reversed? Can you get back those 10 years or not?
Kind of, yeah. There is a bit of work on that in the States. So they've looked at, your caregivers for a spouse with Alzheimer's, and then they've looked at previous caregivers, where you'd think, okay, the stress has now gone away. And for some of the immune measures, you still see an ongoing impact. Although I actually question that work and say, is it now that you're seeing an impact of bereavement? But there is, for some immune outcomes, there is evidence that it still lingers on for a bit. I think we'd have to follow up people for much longer to really see at what point does it change, and perhaps you get your immune function back to at least where it was beforehand.
Just a quick question on the question you asked people about their time again when they choose another partner. Just out of curiosity, what was the consensus? Oh, yeah. Was it 50% yes? Or?
Pretty much. Yes, but the good news was that this only matters if you're under 75. Okay, by the time you're over 75, it didn't matter as much whether you were happily married or not. I think maybe at some point, and I'm not saying this point is 75, but at some point in later life, you just need someone there to ring for the ambulance. Okay? Before that, quality matters.
Okay, my question really relates to the studies that you've done, and you've talked about stress, but we know that stress, anxiety and depression hunt in packs. What's the effect of anxiety and depression in this cycle of stress response, stress and vaccine response?
Okay, so yes, obviously stress can lead to depression and anxiety, and there's also a bit of a vicious cycle going back the way as well. So we did, of course, measure those things too. And I have to say, in these studies, people did not have particularly high levels of anxiety or depression. We were able to control for the levels that they did have, and it was still stress that was emerging as the key factor. I think in some of the other work I've done, it really depends on what outcomes you're looking at. So if you're looking more at the development of hypertension, or if you're looking at all-cause mortality, then you start seeing massive effects if you're looking at severe depression and severe anxiety as well as stress. But in these particular studies, stress was the key predictor.
Thank you. There's a question over there.
Thank you. My question is regarding dental students in particular. We did a study, cross-national study, Australia, New Zealand, and Chile. We compared the stress level on the student, and we know that the stress level in the student is high, but dental students have even higher stress than other health professions students. And dentists also, or a health professional also traditionally have higher stress than other professions. So in terms of the students, the university offers a number of possibilities to deal with that, but do you think it's a responsibility of the schools or the faculties to improve that situation?
See, that's tricky because there's a little bit of me that thinks, well, dentists inflict a lot of pain on people, so how much do we really want to improve their lot? But no, that's just me being mean. I think it's both. I think the schools, if they can do something like maybe just getting people to talk out their levels of stress while hopefully doing something physically active, then that's got to be a good thing. I know there's some studies they've started looking at mindfulness because that's the hot topic at the moment in this area. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be in terms of immune function outcomes, but in terms of stress levels, I'm sure something like that would be beneficial. And in the end of the day, though, it comes down to the individual. If the way you cope with stress is to go out and drink a lot and smoke a lot and sit down on your bum a lot, then that's not going to help your situation. So it has to be the individual as well as the school, I think. Exactly. I think you can't go very far as a school yourself. I think, again, it comes back to the person, what are they going to do? And I don't think there is actually one answer. I don't think exercise, physical activity is the solution. I think it's going to be a whole range, and people deal with stress in different ways. So they're going to need different solutions. So for some people, that might be having mentoring support. For others, it might be just make sure they take their annual leave and actually get a break. It's going to be different for different people. Oh, golly. Okay, so I only dabble in the cardiovascular system, so I'm going to focus again on the immune system. And I'd say in these studies, what we would show is you don't die of a broken heart, you die of a broken immune system. So what you're really seeing is the impact of that broken heart, the loss, but having physiological effects coming through to the immune system.
Thank you very much. Made my job a lot easier because, again, we don't have a mind question.